The phrase, "nice guys finish last," is often used in dating contexts to describe a familiar experience, where being overly agreeable or accommodating seems to lead to being overlooked as a romantic option. Underneath that experience, there is often a deeper relational pattern, agreeableness used as a defense mechanism to stay wanted, accepted, and safe. In many cases, these patterns are not random. They tend to form earlier in life, often through relationships with primary caregivers. When emotional needs like validation, safety, or acceptance are not consistently met, it can shape the way love is later pursued. In adulthood, this may show up as fear of rejection, a strong need for approval, suppressed anger, or a less defined sense of identity. Although not an absolute rule, niceness can show up as consistently agreeing with others, overgiving, or subtly shaping oneself to maintain approval in social or romantic contexts. On the surface, these behaviors can look like generosity or emotional sensitivity. Underneath, there is often a gradual pattern of self-abandonment, a tendency to prioritize harmony while repeatedly setting aside one's own needs, preferences, and boundaries, even when it becomes draining. Kindness tends to come from clarity and self-possession, allowing both agreement and disagreement without internal conflict. Niceness often loses that capacity when maintaining approval becomes the priority and disagreement begins to feel risky or destabilizing. Over time, this creates a subtle shift in how someone exists in relationships. They become highly attuned to others, while slowly losing contact with their own preferences. Desires become quieter. Needs get postponed. Personal direction becomes less distinct. Most people have encountered this in some form. Someone agreeable, polite, easy to be around, yet something about the interaction feels slightly unclear. Nothing is necessarily wrong in an obvious sense. Still, there is a lack of presence. No strong edges. No grounded sense of where they stand. Without that, interaction can start to feel less like connection and more like adaptation. Attraction requires contrast. Relationships form in relation to another, not to oneself. When someone is always fully agreeable, distinction and tension fade, and the interaction can start to feel like meeting a reflection rather than another distinct person. A person with their own preferences, with their own boundaries, and with their own internal direction. When one person consistently adapts to avoid tension, the dynamic loses contrast. Without contrast, attraction cannot form. Niceness is often used as a people-pleasing strategy for maintaining connection while avoiding rejection. At some level, the internal logic can sound like, if I reduce friction, I increase connection. If I increase agreement, I reduce the risk of rejection. This pattern is often not consciously recognized or clearly articulated by the person experiencing it. It tends to sit underneath awareness as something felt rather than deliberately chosen. Over time, it can produce an unintended reversal. Connection deepens when people are actually seen, when they are not carefully edited in real time. This is where the phrase, "nice guys finish last," carries an uncomfortable truth. The problem is not kindness itself. It is the position someone takes when he has learned to make his own needs negotiable before anyone has even asked. A man may enter a relationship already treating his desires as secondary. He becomes careful with his opinions, cautious with anger, quick to adjust, slow to ask for anything directly. Over time, others may begin to relate to him through that same arrangement. They may not intend to overlook him. They may not even realize they are doing it. But there is less of him available to meet. In that sense, nice guys often finish last because they have learned to put themselves last. The world begins to reflect back the place they keep occupying. It reflects how much space they believe they are allowed to take. This can feel cruel, because the pattern usually began as a way to stay connected. Being easy, useful, agreeable, and undemanding once made closeness feel safer. But the more someone edits himself to preserve connection, the less present he becomes within it. What gets lost, what gets unexpressed does not disappear. It tends to reappear indirectly. As tension, as confusion in boundaries, as difficulty knowing what is actually wanted, sometimes even as passive aggression. When desire is not expressed directly and boundaries remain unclear, no actual relationship can form. When approval becomes prioritized over honesty, something subtle gets lost, the sense that two distinct people are actually meeting each other. None of this usually comes from intentional deception or manipulation, but the pattern can still function in a way that gradually erases parts of the self in exchange for relational safety. There is a trade being made here. External safety increases, but clarity of self becomes weaker, and over time, that imbalance becomes visible in relationships. This pattern can often be traced back to early caregiver relationships where authentic emotional expression was not consistently met with safety or acceptance. In some cases, a child may be shamed or dismissed when expressing needs directly, such as crying, protesting, or asking for attention. Over time, the child may learn that visibility leads to tension, while suppression leads to safety. From a depth psychology perspective, this can resemble an early relational wound formed in the space between needing connection and learning to suppress expression. What later appears as niceness is often an adaptation shaped by that early environment. The label itself can feel slightly uncomfortable when viewed this way. It points less to personality and more to conditioning. The point is not to reject niceties or to become colder or more detached. What is being described is not a fundamental flaw in character. It is a relational pattern shaped by early experiences around safety, approval, and emotional expression. The way someone relates to disagreement, the way they relate to visibility, the way they relate to their own needs in the presence of others. When these internal dynamics begin to shift, even slightly, the external experience of relationships tends to shift as well. What often becomes clearer is this: connection does not require performance. It requires presence. And presence becomes difficult when parts of the self are constantly being edited in real time. The remedy is not to train yourself to become better, more attractive, or to act like a jerk. It is to begin entertaining a new premise of identity, one that no longer depends on goodness or niceness as proof of worth. It is to start uncovering the parts of ourselves that may have been deemed ugly, unacceptable, or unsafe to show, and to hold those parts in the light of awareness without flinching. Slowly, this becomes a movement towards something more honest, more integrated. For many people, recognizing the pattern in this way is enough to begin loosening the shame around it. What once looked like a flaw can start to be understood as an old strategy for staying connected, one that may have made sense then, but no longer has to determine how much of the self is allowed to be seen.